On July 1, 1997, the Oakland Police Department in California, USA, received a call about a severe fire occurring in the area. The fire had almost completely destroyed the house, with only a large cabinet miraculously left intact. Little did anyone know, inside that cabinet was a horrifying truth. What seemed like an ordinary fire turned out to reveal a terrifying secret that shocked all of California. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our latest videos. On a quiet night on July 1, 1997, in Oakland, California, local police were on their routine shift, chatting lightly and listening to the radio news, when suddenly the telephone rang urgently. On the other end, a panicked voice reported a severe fire happening at a house deep in a narrow alley. Immediately, fire trucks and police cars raced through the deserted streets, their sirens blaring and red and blue lights flashing, waking the quiet neighborhood. When they arrived at the scene, the sight was horrifying. The red flames, like a giant monster furiously devouring the house. Neighbors, with faces smeared and flushed from the heat, were desperately trying to rescue the homeowner, Stevie Allman, a 52-year-old woman. After a search, they found Stevie lying near a window, her body scorched by the flames and rendered extremely weak. The pain on the woman's face was a clear testament to the horror of the fire. The police and neighbors worked together, putting in their utmost effort to rescue Stevie from the fire. The severe burns had affected about 15% of the woman's body, and her condition was rapidly deteriorating. Firefighters urgently placed Stevie on a stretcher and quickly transported her to the nearest hospital. Everyone watched anxiously as the ambulance departed, deeply concerned for the fate of this unfortunate woman. The fierce fire had ravaged Stevie Allman's house, destroying almost all of her belongings. The blazing flames were responsible for killing Stevie's 2 loyal dogs. The house was now reduced to empty window frames, scorched walls, and a chaotic mess of ashes and debris. When Stevie returned from the hospital, the sight before her was tragic. The belongings were burned to ashes, and household items had turned into piles of charcoal and rusted metal. The indescribable pain of loss was evident in Stevie's eyes, filled with despair as she looked at the wreckage of her own home. The surrounding neighbors, with sympathy and compassion, were constantly discussing the cause of the fire. Some speculated that it might have been an unexpected accident, while others worried about potential negligence that could have led to the disaster. In contrast to the speculations, Stevie did not believe this was an accidental fire and knew the true cause of the blaze. When the police and firefighters arrived at the scene to investigate the cause of the fire, they found Stevie Allman in a state of exhaustion and distress. Despite her painful burns, she remained very resilient. Stevie began to provide the police with some important information about the incident. Stevie was an unemployed resident of a troubled area of town. Recently, she had decided to stand up against the rampant crime and drug activity in her neighborhood. Stevie recounted that she had used her camera to record suspicious activities from the window of her house. The videos she collected captured scenes of drug traffickers exchanging goods, along with other criminal transactions and activities. She sent these videos directly to the police, aiming to provide evidence and assist in their investigation. With a determined attitude, Stevie asserted that the criminals were aware of her activities and that the fire was an act of revenge against her. They thought that if I were dead, their drug dealing would become cleaner, Stevie said, emphasizing her suspicions about the motive of the perpetrators. The investigators were baffled by Stevie's strong assertion. They could not immediately find a clear connection between the fire and the drug traffickers she mentioned. However, when the initial investigation results were released, the investigators confirmed that the fire was indeed caused by arson. Before the flames destroyed Stevie Allman's house, authorities had discovered 2 bombs secretly placed outside her home. Although these bombs had not detonated, they were a clear sign that Stevie had been targeted by drug traffickers long before the fire occurred. Both bomb discoveries were reported and investigated, but the evidence and information collected were not sufficient to lead to the arrest of any suspects. With evidence indicating that this was a deliberate attack on Stevie, the investigators decided to not only determine the cause of the fire, but also to conduct a comprehensive investigation to clarify the case. But as soon as the police began their investigation into the fire, 52-year-old Stevie Allman reacted in a surprising way. The enthusiasm and determination of the investigators seemed to be unwelcome to her. The police were puzzled and confused when she requested them to stop their investigation and not come looking for her anymore. Stevie explained that she felt harassed and believed that the criminals would no longer have the capability to carry out further attacks. Stevie firmly dismissed the police from her home and slammed the door shut. The police, standing outside, looked at each other in confusion. Just before that, she had shown extreme outrage towards the traffickers. But now, when the police promised to investigate and find those responsible for the attack, she was angry and actively obstructing them. The clear contradiction in her actions raised suspicions among the investigators. As the police left the area, Stevie stood behind the door, breathing a sigh of relief. Her forehead was drenched in sweat, and her face showed signs of stress and worry. Clearly, she did not want the police to continue coming to her home and delving deeper into the case. This was because she feared that the secrets she was hiding would be uncovered. So what exactly is Stevie Allman hiding? After the fire, the story of Stevie Allman quickly became the focus of public attention. The painful details of her life, along with images of the destroyed house, attracted widespread interest from the community. People from all over came together to donate money and items to help her rebuild the destroyed house and buy new dogs, aiming to ease her pain of loss. In response to the immense public interest, the authorities became even more determined to find the culprit responsible for the fire at Stevie's house. To expedite the investigation, the state governor decided to offer an unprecedented large reward, $50,000 for any valuable information that could help solve the case. However, what puzzled everyone was that despite the generous reward, the police received no information from the public. This silence was difficult to explain and left the investigators baffled. The large reward should have attracted attention and encouraged people to come forward, but the reality was the complete opposite. Sometime after the fire at Stevie Allman's house gained public attention, a strange event occurred. Just a few miles south of Oakland, in a small town called Scotts Valley, a relative of Stevie unexpectedly sent a report to local authorities, reporting a case of a missing person. Leota Belleville, Stevie's sister, felt a deep concern and sensed something was amiss after reading news about the fire at her sister's house. In her report, she revealed a shocking detail to the investigators. According to Leota, the burned house did not only have Stevie and 2 dogs. The revelation threw the police into disarray, prompting a series of urgent questions. The police quickly realized that Leota's information could be the key to unlocking the case. With this new development, the investigation became far more intense and complex. Investigators began to suspect that the fire was not merely an incident of arson, but might be hiding a more sinister secret. Leota's disclosure was startling. Another person, Sarah Mitchell, Leota's own sister, had been living in the house with Stevie for a long time. Leota confirms that Sarah had been living there for a long time, and this has been verified by several neighbors in the area. They reported having seen Sarah's figure through the window and during her visits, but no one paid much attention to the presence of this woman. When the police asked Leota why she hadn't visited Stevie in the hospital, Leota asserted that the woman they had rescued and tried to protect was not Stevie. Leota's claim shocked the investigators. At this moment, the investigators were stunned to realize that they had never once checked the identity of the person they had rescued and been cooperating with throughout the investigation. From the very beginning, they had believed everything that Mrs. Stevie had said. The police immediately set about reinvestigating from scratch, looking into the woman who claimed to be Stevie Allman and examining all details related to clarify the mystery of the case. The police began reinvestigating the case from a different angle. They quickly realized that the sisters Sarah and Stevie had lived together in the house for 20 years. Other siblings provided additional important information about Sarah, who was described as having a stubborn and eccentric personality. Sarah frequently stole Stevie's belongings and had even pretended to be her sister to access her personal accounts. With this information, the police decided it was necessary to search the house. they obtained a court order to search Stevie and Sarah's house, despite the strong objections from the woman living there. That afternoon, the police brought along search dogs and went to the house. When they arrived, the woman they believed to be Stevie answered the door. She was extremely adamant about not allowing the police into the house. However, when the police presented the search warrant, she reluctantly allowed them inside. The house was still under repair, with things scattered and disorganized everywhere, making the search even more difficult. The police, along with the search dogs, scoured every corner of the house. Suddenly, one of the dogs began barking loudly in a corner of the house. The police rushed toward the sound, with the dog continuing to signal. In front of them was a refrigerator that had been tightly wrapped with tape and scorched almost entirely. The detectives carefully opened the refrigerator, and what they found inside horrified them. Inside the refrigerator was a nearly decomposed corpse, crawling with maggots and emitting a strong odor of decay. The body was that of Stevie Ullman, the true owner of the house. The investigators were stunned and shocked by this discovery. They realized they had been deceived all along. So who exactly was the woman standing before them? The person they believed to be Stevie Ullman was actually Sarah Mitchell, Stevie's biological sister. Sarah had been quietly pretending to be her sister to cover up her own criminal actions. Sarah was the youngest of 5 sisters, with a difficult and harsh personality. She could not get along with anyone except Stevie. Stevie, always gentle and unconditional in her love, had endured Sarah's unpleasant habits and frequently accommodated her to avoid upsetting her sister. When Stevie moved out to live on her own, Sarah decided to follow her. The 2 sisters lived in a small house in Oakland, where their life seemed to be harmonious. While Stevie took care of everything in the house, from cleaning, cooking, to earning money to support both of them, Sarah simply sat idle, never lifting a finger. The meager support money from Stevie was insufficient to meet Sarah's spending needs. She continuously nagged and even forced Stevie to take on more jobs to provide for her. Thus, for decades, as Sarah entered her 40s, she did nothing but enjoy a lavish lifestyle funded by her sister's money. Over time, Stevie became increasingly exhausted, both physically and mentally. Living with Sarah had become an unbearable burden. The once gentle and patient sister had gradually disappeared, replaced by a weary and drained Stevie, who had been shouldering the responsibility of supporting her troublesome sister for years. After many sleepless nights, Stevie made a final decision. It was time for Sarah to fend for herself and take responsibility for her own life. Stevie needed time to take care of herself and regain the peace she had lost for so long. When Sarah heard these words from her sister, she seemed to go mad. Her face twisted with anger. Her eyes were cloudy with hatred. She smashed things, screamed in rage, and charged at Stevie, shoving her. Sarah berated her sister as selfish for only thinking about herself. "It's time for you to take care of yourself, Sarah. I can't keep supporting you like this forever. I need to live my own life," Stevie said, her voice calm but lacking the previous patience. Stevie's words only made Sarah angrier. Unable to control her fury, Sarah destroyed the furniture, smashing everything in sight. In a fit of rage, Sarah charged at Stevie. With eyes blazing with anger, she moved closer to Stevie and threatened, "If you dare cut off the allowance, I'll kill you." Stevie, exhausted from supporting her sister for half her life, ignored the threat. She wearily stood up, brushed her hands off, and turned her back, leaving Sarah seething with anger behind. Stevie did not realize that this time, Sarah was not just making idle threats. Sarah was truly prepared to end her sister's life. Immediately, Sarah rushed to the kitchen, her eyes full of murderous intent, gripping a sharp knife from the drawer. Sarah stormed into Stevie's room with terrifying determination. Stevie, sitting in the room, was completely unaware of the impending danger. Without giving her sister a chance to react, Sarah violently attacked Stevie repeatedly, each stab filled with hatred. Stevie died within seconds. Her body collapsed onto the cold floor, blood spreading everywhere. Sarah, covered in blood, stood there, breathing heavily. No tears, no remorse, She looked at Stevie's corpse and smiled with satisfaction. After killing her sister, Sarah immediately ordered a large refrigerator, big enough to contain Stevie's body. Once she placed Stevie inside the refrigerator, Sarah tightly wrapped it in tape to contain the odor of decay. Stevie's body was hidden in the house, and Sarah began a bizarre charade. She would become Stevie. Sarah exploited the physical resemblance and habits between the two sisters to execute her dark plan. She continued to live as if she were Stevie, answering neighbors' questions and participating in daily activities that only Stevie used to do. She made the neighbors believe that Stevie was still alive, while in reality, the poor woman had been murdered and concealed in the taped-up refrigerator. But Sarah knew that Stevie's death could not be hidden forever. Fearing that her sister's body would eventually be discovered, Sarah quietly devised another plan. She decided to stage a house fire, intending to destroy all evidence of her crime. She believed that the refrigerator in Stevie's body would turn to ashes, and her crime would never be discovered. But what Sarah did not anticipate was that the refrigerator containing Stevie's body was not completely destroyed. Fate demanded that Sarah pay the price. The refrigerator, with its horrifying truth inside, became the damning evidence of her cruel crime. Sarah was eventually forced to admit her horrific act. On July 23, 1997, after weeks of investigation and questioning, the police officially charged Sarah Mitchell with the murder of her sister, Stevie Ullman. The news quickly spread, shocking not only the family, but also the community where the two sisters had lived peacefully for many years. Sarah's trial took place in November 2000, where prosecutors laid out the entire horrifying truth. They argued that Sarah killed Stevie not only due to family conflicts, but primarily to seize her sister's assets. Sarah's greed and jealousy drove her to plan the murder of the sister who had once loved her dearly, and then to impersonate Stevie to continue enjoying the money her sister had saved throughout her life. On November 21, 2000, the jury took little time to deliver their verdict. Sarah Mitchell was convicted of first-degree murder, a severe sentence for the brutal crime she had committed. Without a tear or a word of remorse, Sarah stood silently in the courtroom, facing her predetermined fate. At the sentencing, despite enduring immense pain from Stevie's tragic death, Sarah's family did not want to witness another loss. They unanimously requested that the court refrain from imposing the death penalty on Sarah. A family member tearfully spoke in court. "We have already suffered enough. If the court takes her life, it will be another knife to the heart of our family." The family's pleas moved the courtroom. Ultimately, the judge decided against the death penalty, instead sentencing Sarah to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Sarah Mitchell, who once lived under the care of her loving sister, now faced long, endless days in prison, confronting the guilt of her own actions.
On July 18, 2009, 5 members of a family, including a couple, their 2 sons, and the wife's sister, were discovered dead at their home. The wounds on the victims and the evidence at the scene indicated that, before their deaths, all of them had been brutally beaten with an object resembling a hammer. The only survivor of this tragedy was the family's eldest daughter, who was away on a school trip to New Caledonia at the time. The horrific nature of this massacre was such that the media referred to it as one of the bloodiest murder cases in Australian history. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our latest videos. On the morning of July 18, 2009, Kathy Lynn noticed that her brother's news agency was not open as usual. This was quite puzzling, as her brother and sister-in-law had never closed the shop. If they were away, they would ask Kathy or a neighbor to look after the store. She tried calling her brother, but there was no answer. Sensing something was wrong, Kathy immediately woke her husband, Robert Shee, who was still groggy. The two quickly drove to her brother's house to check on them. Around 9 a.m., they arrived and knocked on the door continuously but received no response. Fearing the worst, Kathy used the spare key and opened the door. As the door swung open, both were stunned by the horrifying scene inside the house. In the home in northern Melbourne, blood was splattered everywhere. Blood spattered on the walls, door handles, and surrounding furniture. Panicking, Kathy looked around and saw her sister-in-law's body in the guest bedroom, covered in blood. In the master bedroom, the bodies of her sister-in-law and Min Lin, Kathy's brother, were found together, also covered in blood. Blood trails led to the children's room, where both had also been killed. The ghastly scene, like something out of a horror movie, overwhelmed Kathy. She screamed in terror, and her husband, Robert Shai, was visibly shocked. They could not believe that such a sudden and brutal tragedy had befallen their relatives. After discovering the bloody scene, Kathy Lin quickly called the police to report the incident, while her husband, Robert Shai, went to inform her parents. Calling the emergency hotline with a fearful and trembling voice, Kathy Lin described, "She needed someone to come quickly, as she thought someone had killed her brother and sister-in-law. Someone had attacked their entire family. Police and emergency services arrived promptly at Min Lin's house, but they could not save the victims." The police confirmed that the 5 deceased family members were Min Lin, 45 years old, his wife, Lily Lin, 43 years old, his sister-in-law, Irene Lin, and their 2 sons, Henry, 12, and Terry, 9, all of whom had been brutally beaten to death with a bludgeon at their home in North Epping, Sydney. The only survivor of this tragedy was Min Lin's eldest daughter, Brenda, who was away on a school trip to New Caledonia at the time. On July 19, 2009, Brenda Lin, a 15-year-old participating in a school-organized overseas trip, received a shocking phone call from the police. Her entire family had been murdered. At the same time, Australian media were continuously reporting on the horrific massacre that occurred at the Lin family's home in the suburban area of Epping, Sydney. No one could imagine the traumatic shock a 15-year-old girl would experience upon learning of such a tragedy happening in her own home. Upon receiving the call from the police, Brenda fainted, unable to bear the overwhelming grief. The incident quickly became a major shock across Australia, causing widespread alarm. Mr. Min Lin and his wife were immigrants who left their hometown in China in the early 1990s, hoping to find a better life in Australia. With dreams and determination to build a new future, Mr. Min began a new life by opening a small news agency, which provided enough income to support his wife and children. Though the work was not easy, Mr. Min, through hard work and perseverance, managed to establish a stable and peaceful life for his family. Thanks to his steady job and relentless efforts, by 1996, Mr. Min Lin decided to bring the rest of his family from China to Australia to reunite and build a new life together in their new homeland. Mr. Min had a younger sister named Kathy. In 1998, Kathy married a doctor named Robert Shi in Guangzhou, and they welcomed their first child in 2000. The Lin family's life in Australia gradually stabilized, becoming warm and promising with future plans full of hope. With their simple, down-to-earth lifestyle, Mr. Min's family was greatly loved by their neighbors. They were seen as a model family to look up to, so no one could harbor any ill will towards this kind-hearted family. So what could be the motive behind this brutal murder? Could it be a gang-related hit, a revenge over debts, or something else? Who could have killed the entire Lin family while they were asleep? The massacre drew significant public attention, prompting the police to rush their investigation with the goal of apprehending the perpetrator as quickly as possible. The police quickly arrived at the crime scene and began collecting evidence. According to the police report, the victims were beaten so severely that their faces were distorted to the extent that multiple forensic methods were required to identify them. This explains the blood splattered throughout the house, from the floor to the ceiling, creating an overwhelmingly red and haunting scene. There were no signs of forced entry into the house. Everything was left in its place, but the power was cut, suggesting that the perpetrator was likely someone known to the Lin family, possibly someone with a key who was very familiar with the layout of the house. The most suspicious detail was that Brenda's room, the only surviving daughter's room, was locked from start to finish, as if the perpetrator knew Brenda was not at home. The family's belongings were not stolen, and there were no signs of a search through the house. Based on the shoe prints found in the house, investigators also determined that the perpetrator acted alone. Combining all the evidence, the police concluded that this was not a random robbery, but a premeditated murder. The perpetrator was someone known to the family who harbored deep hatred towards Mr. and Mrs. Min. Mr. and Mrs. Min were found dead in their master bedroom, killed by blunt force trauma to the head. Irene Lin was found dead in the guest bedroom. Besides the fatal wounds on her body, there were also several injuries on Irene's arms, indicating that she had tried to defend herself before dying. In the children's bedroom, there were also numerous bloodstains. The police speculated that the children might have woken up during the murder and struggled with the perpetrator. The police began focusing their attention on Robert and his wife, the first people to arrive at the crime scene, as they were the only ones with a spare key to the Lin house and were very familiar with it. Robert and his wife lived only 300 meters from the Lin house, so they could have returned home after committing the crime without anyone noticing. The police summoned Robert and his wife for questioning, hoping to uncover important clues. However, after several hours of interrogation, both were released due to the lack of any clear evidence linking them to the crime. The identity of the perpetrator and the true motive behind the massacre remained a mystery. Sometime after the tragedy, Robert Shi unexpectedly offered to adopt Brenda, the niece who had lost her entire family in the horrific crime. He told everyone that he and his wife wanted to care for Brenda, hoping to alleviate the pain she was enduring and to take over the role of raising her in place of his deceased brother and sister-in-law. Everyone was moved by the uncle's offer to protect and care for his beloved niece in such a difficult situation. Robert Shi's decision quickly gained support from those around him. Other family members also agreed that it made the most sense for Brenda to live with her aunt and uncle. This arrangement would not only provide Brenda with a place to rely on, but also allow her to continue her life in a familiar environment, where she could find comfort and support from the remaining loved ones. However, contrary to everyone's expectations and hopes, Brenda's pain was not alleviated. Instead, the 15-year-old girl was about to face the most horrific days of her life. What Brenda had to confront afterwards was no different from a nightmare, turning her life into a series of dark and despairing days. 6 months had passed since the horrific massacre, but the public remained in turmoil as the perpetrator still lurked in the shadows. Meanwhile, the police worked tirelessly around the clock, determined to reach a final conclusion to clarify the case. Through relentless efforts, a series of new clues were discovered, and the portrait of the perpetrator gradually took shape. During the meticulous investigation of the crime scene, the police collected 24 footprints of the perpetrator. According to analysis, these footprints all belonged to the same person. Using advanced technical methods, the police discovered that these footprints came from a pair of men's Asics running shoes. Surprisingly, Robert also owned a pair of such shoes, which further heightened suspicion against him. Not stopping there, during a thorough search, the police also found a massage device in Robert's home that resembled the weapon they suspected had been used in the crime, a device similar to a fabric-wrapped hammer. With these clues, Robert was quickly placed on the list of primary suspects in the case. However, learning from the previous lack of conclusive evidence, the police decided to act cautiously. To avoid disturbing the snake and alerting the grass, they devised a meticulous plan to prove Robert's involvement in the case and that he was concealing something. The police secretly installed mini surveillance cameras in Robert's home, closely monitoring every move of this seemingly kind man. A few days after the cameras were installed, Robert's actions were revealed. One of the cameras captured Robert tearing apart a shoebox, throwing it into the toilet, and flushing it. At the same time, the police also unexpectedly uncovered a horrifying secret within Robert's family that no one could have imagined. Monitoring the surveillance footage, the investigation team was shocked by the images of Robert. Even more surprising was that, when the police observed Brenda's reaction, despite her clear fear, there was no sign of any vigorous resistance. Instead, Brenda displayed resignation and endurance, as if Robert's actions had become so familiar and frequent that she no longer had the strength to resist these heinous acts. This resignation clearly indicated that this was not the first time Brenda had been assaulted by her own uncle. These horrifying pieces of evidence not only reinforced the police's suspicions about Robert Shee's involvement in the massacre, but also revealed a chilling dark side of Robert's family. It turned out that adopting Brenda after the tragic event did not come from affection, as Robert had claimed. The truth was that this depraved man had seized the opportunity when his niece was vulnerable and without support to carry out his plan to bring her home and fulfill his dark intentions. Since Brenda returned to live with Robert and his wife, her life had turned into a nightmare. Not a day went by without Brenda being harassed by her own uncle. What was even more heartbreaking was that Kathy Lynn, Brenda's aunt, was completely unaware of all this. Kathy remained convinced that Brenda was living happily in the loving care of her and Robert, not suspecting that the husband she trusted was actually a monster, torturing her young niece both physically and mentally, every day, every hour. It wasn't until 2011 that the police uncovered additional crucial evidence in the case. They discovered that on the morning of the massacre, Robert Z. had cleaned the garage to eliminate evidence, but he could not have anticipated that traces of blood remained and were later found by investigators. The blood, containing the DNA of 4 of the 5 victims, was the decisive evidence pointing to Robert Shee as the perpetrator of this major crime. In May 2011, the police arrested Robert, then 47 years old, on charges of murder. In court, Robert consistently denied his crimes, maintaining his facade of decency until the end. Kathy was resolute in her disbelief that her husband had committed a crime. She went to great lengths to hire lawyers and even testified on Robert's behalf. The court held 3 trials in July 2013, March 2014, and February 2015. However, due to a lack of evidence, Robert was not convicted and was released on bail a few months later. Unwilling to let the perpetrator remain free, the police continued their efforts, persistently searching for remaining clues. During this process, they quickly discovered another blood stain on the floor of Robert and Kathy's garage. Tests revealed that this blood contained the DNA of 4 of the Lynn family victims, providing undeniable evidence of Robert Shee's direct involvement in the massacre. The police speculated that this blood might have fallen from the weapon or from the perpetrator himself while he was cleaning up after the crime. With this crucial evidence, the police promptly filed a new petition with the court, leading to the 4th trial in June 2016 in Sydney. During this trial, the police presented all the collected evidence and recreated the horrific events of that night. According to the police's conclusion, on that night, Robert Shee left his home just a few hours after having dinner with his family. Before committing the crime, Shee had drugged his wife to ensure she would not be aware of his brutal acts. To enter his in-laws' house, Shee used a key he had prepared earlier. After cutting the power to avoid detection, he stealthily went upstairs to where the victims were sleeping. Prosecutors argued that after murdering Min Lin and his wife, Shee quickly moved through the hallway to attack Irene, Lin's sister-in-law. The victims were arranged in a V shape on the bed, indicating meticulous planning. Although the murder weapon was never found, the prosecutors speculate that it was similar to a hammer, assembled with enough force to commit the crime. Although the 3 adults in the family might not have seen Robert Shee's face in the dark, there is evidence that the 2 boys in the case woke up and tried to escape. This likely led Shee to decide to kill the boys, fearing they could identify him. After committing the crime, Robert Shee quietly went down the stairs and left the house through the front door, attempting to conceal all traces of the crime he had just committed. However, these efforts were not enough to cover up the truth, and eventually, his horrific crimes were exposed. In the trial at the New South Wales Supreme Court, evidence of a violent struggle in the bedroom was shown. This was evidenced by the injuries on the victims. The fact that Brenda's room was not opened supports the prosecution's hypothesis against Robert Shee. They argue that the killer must have known the house well, so he knew that the room was empty that night. During Robert's trials, Brenda took the stand and provided testimony that enraged everyone present in the courtroom. Brenda testified that she was not just a victim of Robert once, starting from when she was 14 years old. After adopting Brenda, Robert's behavior became even more brazen. For 2 years, Robert secretly entered Brenda's room each week, attacking her up to 4 times a week. Previously, Brenda did not report the abuse due to continuous threats from Robert. It was only when the police obtained concrete evidence that she dared to publicly reveal Robert's true nature. From Brenda's revelations, the police speculated that Robert's motive for murdering the Lynn family was jealousy of his brother-in-law's success, a scheme to seize assets and to satisfy his depraved desires. Originally an ENT doctor in China, Robert, upon immigrating to Australia, opened a restaurant but failed. He expressed feelings of embarrassment and inferiority when compared to his brother-in-law's status. Brenda's absence on the day of the crime was also part of Robert's plan, as by adopting her, he would acquire the Lynn family's assets and have the opportunity to coerce Brenda. Kathy broke down in tears, completely refusing to accept the police investigation's findings. In her pain and despair, she could not believe that the husband she had always trusted could be the perpetrator. Kathy even turned against her own niece, accusing Brenda of lying and deliberately setting her husband up as a scapegoat. Blinded by love and a desperate desire to protect her husband, Kathy made the decision to sever ties with her own family, abandoning her loved ones to stand by the husband she still believed was innocent. On February 13, 2017, the judge sentenced Robert to 5 consecutive life sentences without parole for 5 counts of murder, as Australia does not have the death penalty. Robert maintained his innocence and filed an appeal in June 2020. On February 15, 2021, the court rejected Robert's appeal, upholding the original sentence. The case ultimately concluded, but the suffering remains. A girl lost her entire family in a massacre. 2 elderly people grieved the loss of their grandchildren. A wife and children lost their husband and father. Most of all, it is unimaginable to realize that she had spent so many years with a monster. Even now, Kathy still believes her husband is innocent and blames the family and the legal system for falsely accusing Robert Shea. For many years, Kathy Lynn played the role of a loyal wife to Robert Shea. Kathy was labeled a liar in court for staunchly defending her despicable husband, having to endure the bloody details of the murders repeated over 4 trials. Now Kathy must face society as the wife of a convicted murderer who was found guilty of killing 5 members of his own family. Thank you for listening to today's case story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch more intriguing cases on the channel.